It's wonderful to look out and see this space filled all the way to the end. This is a family reunion. Whether born in this family or adopted into this family or married to somebody in this family, it is a joy to have us together. Though it's not the most celebratory setting. No food, no drink. But it has its own significance. In light of us being all together, there are places I would like to take us, like Kauai. A beautiful place. And I'd like to create a guided visualization of standing and watching a waterfall and the rainbow at the base and feeling embraced by the sun. That would be a pretty place to take us. We could go to the Maldives, those islands surrounded by some of the most beautiful corals in the world, and you dive down and you're aware that there's a whole world that you don't normally experience of kaleidoscope colors of coral and schools of fish. Those are places I've been to, and they're with me. Sometimes if I can't fall asleep at night, I'll, in my mind, go to those places. It'd be nice to take us all there. But instead, I'm going to take you someplace else. Someplace dark. Someplace chilled. Another place that I have been to, in fact, not just me. In this room are at least 20 people who joined me along with Ari Katz on behalf of the Community Scholar Program, CBI, going this summer to Lithuania and Poland. So let me take you to another place, and I do so not to stay there, which is the nature of this sermon, not to stay there, but to emerge from that place, from those places, stronger, more proud of being Jewish, and more aware of our responsibility as Jews to stand for something that's right and be opposed to that which is morally wrong. Ponar. Ponar are forests about an hour from Vilna. Vilna, that's the city in Lithuania that for hundreds of years was called the Jerusalem of Lithuania. Contemporaneous of George Washington was the Vilna Gaon. It was said of the Vilna Gaon, the genius of Vilna, that he only needed to sleep 2 hours a night. And he would use his enormous talent, his enormous learning, to write commentaries not only on the Torah, but the Talmud, not just the Babylonian Talmud, but the Jerusalem Talmud, on Jewish law and on Jewish mysticism. And he in Vilna had the kind of congregation where one of his congregants was the Maggid of Dubno, who I spoke of last night, the one who told that parable of the person who always got the bullseyes by shooting first and drawing the circle later. He had a disciple, Chaim of Volozhin. His disciple created the first yeshiva, the first university of study. And that yeshiva, a suburb of Vilna, would go on to become a model for Mir and Punyevich and many other cities in Lithuania and then throughout the world, yeshivot that still thrive throughout Israel, throughout the United States. Ponar is an hour from Vilna. On the cusp of the 20th century, Vilna was almost half Jewish. Close to 60,000 Jews. That was true at the start of World War. That wasn't quite true at the start of World War II because many Jews left Vilna, many to South Africa. But still Vilna on the cusp of World War II was 1/3 Jewish. Ponar but an hour away. The area had been divided between the Russians and the Germans in 1939. The Russians controlled the Vilna area, and they began to dig these enormous holes to store oil, 6 large oils in Ponar. In 1941, in the summer, the Germans kicked the Russians out, and they said to the Lithuanian police and to volunteers, take the Jews out. Within 6 months, from July to the beginning of 1942, the majority of Jews were taken from Vilna to Ponar. And when they arrived, they were asked to turn over any possessions, and then they were asked to move toward these holes. These holes in Ponar are now covered with grass. To be in Ponar now is to be in a forest. It's very peaceful. When our group of 36 was in Ponar, we were the only ones there. It was very pretty. Trees, grass. If only those trees could speak. For the Jews were led to these big, big pits. You can still get a sense of them because they have like brick surrounding perimeter. And they're, let's say, about as big, about like this room. And the Jews were told to undress and shot. It was murder by bullet. Tens of thousands. I'll take you to another place. Again, not a place that feels like a tourist location, but this place is packed with tourists. It's Auschwitz. Auschwitz today, in contrast to those killing fields of Ponar, which was the first mass execution of Jews in World War II. In Auschwitz, that was toward the end of the war, the creation of extermination camps where people would be brought systematically. In Auschwitz today, there are crowds speaking every human language. And as a Jew, you pause and you say, do they know this is about us? Do they know this is a place where most overwhelmingly of the people were brought to be executed because they were Jews? As I was with our group, I kind of broke away. You see, Auschwitz has a special place. I had been there once before. I had been there as a young man with my brother. I was 20 years old. At that time, Auschwitz was controlled by the Poles. The only thing that was going on is they had a documentary of the Russians that they made liberating Auschwitz. You couldn't understand. I'm not sure if it was Polish or Russian. All I could see is healthy soldiers and emaciated survivors. But now it was different. Now there were crowds at Auschwitz, but I needed to be alone because my mother had been in Auschwitz. And as I stood in those barracks, 3 high, wood, in which people were crammed together, I said to the tour guide, one of the guides who was with me, I said, you know, my mother was here. She said, really, what kind of work did she do here in Auschwitz II, Birkenau? And I said, I don't know. She said, well, everybody had a job. As long as you were in Birkenau, Auschwitz II, you were slave labor, you were doing something. But I didn't grow up hearing the stories of the sounds of Auschwitz, of the smells of Auschwitz, of the horror of moment-by-moment uncertainty. I grew up with pivotal moments in those terrible months, the 6 months she was in Auschwitz and about 6 months in forced labor outside from which she would escape with 3 sisters. And it occurred to me that my mother was no longer alive, nor her 3 sisters. I could no longer ask them, what kind of work did you do in Auschwitz? And so as I walked, I separated a bit from the group, and I began to sing. A lullaby of my mother, both to honor her presence and to be comforted. You know, we Jews, we go to places to remember. We don't dwell there. We do it in a less dramatic way at Passover. We gather as families around our tables, and we tell a story that if we thought about the story, you see, we often don't really pause, but if we thought about it, we would be talking about cruelty, human cruelty. That's what the Torah says. The slavery in Egypt was befarech, with cruelty. They were beaten. They had no control over their lives. And the most horrible, they had no control over their children. Their children could be taken away and sold as property. That which was most precious to you, you did not have a claim to. You had no claim to be treated like a human being. And that's why when we sit at our tables, we are told, taste the bitter herb, and may your eyes water with tears. It's hard for us to imagine, to go to those places of pain. But the wisdom that we have as a collective is that unless we take the strength, the courage to go there, life can be superficial and more. We go there as Jews to slavery on Passover because we come out of it stronger. The message of the Seder is not to wallow in the pain. The message of the Seder is not to see ourselves as of people who are victims. The message of our tradition is that we go to that place of memory to feel responsibility, to alleviate the suffering of others. At our Seders, we have children, because that story we are taught need to be handed down from generation to generation, and the children are prepped. Manishtana halayla hazeh. 4 questions. I'd like to share 4 questions in regard to the Holocaust. How could it have happened? Why did some people ignore our plight and others risk their lives for us? Where was God? And what would I have done if I was there? I will add, at the Seder, there's 4 questions, but there's a cup for Elijah. Technically, it's because there's a 5th question, and I will get to that too. A 5th question that points to the future. So how did it happen? Didn't the Germans know how wrong it was to kill Jews, how immoral it is? Didn't the Nazis feel that they were doing something wrong? They did not. At least not the Nazis. You can YouTube Himmler, October 1943, Posen, Poland. It's a short speech on YouTube. You can hear his voice, and then you can see the German and the English. And here's what Heinrich Himmler, who's the head of the German police, Minister of the Interior in 1943, what he says to scores of SS leaders: killing Jews is hard. It's difficult to see bodies piled up. But we are in need of these acts. It's an act of self-defense for Germany. The Jews undermined us in World War I. And if we don't act now, we could lose this war too. They are bacillus. Those are his words. Bacillus, an infestation on our body. They are not human. They are a danger. And to kill the Jews is to defend our great nation. It's a noble act, not one that we need to talk much about, but to find the strength to do for the future of our people. Did they think they were immoral? No. My brother, my parents, my mother, for 7 years was unable to have a child. Her body shut down after the war. Just night before last, I reread her autobiography, in which she writes about 7 years and no children after she was married, and going to a doctor and finding some help. And my older brother was a source of great joy and celebration. Maybe because he's older than me, he developed a stronger curiosity about the Holocaust. Remember, he was born in 1952. 7 years after my mother's liberation, my father's liberation. I, too, was born in single digits. It's hard for me sometimes to imagine as a parent, less than a decade from such a trauma, being a parent and raising children. My parents were able to do so with love. So I said to my brother Mark, how do you understand? How did this happen? He says, it's very simple. It's a product of fear and labeling. He said, think of a spider. Most people are afraid of spiders, but spiders aren't dangerous. Spiders are necessary, they're helpful. But people don't make the distinction between the overwhelming number of spiders and black widow spiders, and so they stomp on a spider. He said, it's very simple. The Germans did not see themselves as killing children. 1.5 million children. They were Jewish children. Jewish children. Not like us. Not human. He said, know that that's human nature. It's human nature to simplify. It's human nature to be afraid and to label. How did it happen? It happened in some cases because Jews thought, well, this will just blow over. It'll happen in others because God will come to the rescue. It happened because Germans allowed themselves and others to ratchet down with what is right or wrong. One scholar said to me, if the Nazi Party ran on the platform, we're going to kill the Jews, they would never have been elected. But law after law and lie after lie and disinformation after disinformation created a sense of feeling overwhelmed, that no one could feel what is right or wrong anymore, what is truth anymore, who to believe anymore. And there was fear. For to save a Jew meant to risk your life. The second question, how is it that some people allowed it to happen and others saved? It's not clear. For most, it was the sense of, I'm not getting involved. It's politics. Let's not discuss politics, please. If we discuss politics, what are we going to gain? We're only going to fight. Politics. That's what it was about. Damn straight. It was about politics, about government. And most people just feel like, who am I? Who am I with the big powers of government? Live my life. There was a saying in Nazi Germany, Marilyn Horan taught me, the professor from Chapman. And Nazis taught, you have to take the good with the bad. Take the good with the bad. Yeah, there's things you may not like, but live your life. Ignore. And that sense of right and wrong over the years just ratcheted down. But there were those who literally risked their lives to save Jews. Jack Pariser is here, a dear teacher and friend. Jack, with his parents and his sister from Poland, spent 28 months in hiding. And Jack has been my teacher to say that everybody who survived had a non-Jew help them survive, the righteous of the nations. And in Jack's case, there were 7 different groups, but 2 particular whose names I want to say because they deserve to be honored. Andrei Perensky, an employee of Jack's father, and his father's friend, Leon Zvetsek, who risked their lives to hide the Parisers in barns, enabling them to survive. There, people saved people because they saw the other as a friend. Having relationships mattered. Just in the last few weeks, I learned of a more dramatic story, not more dramatic, dramatic only in the following way. In terms of an entire town that saved Jews. In the mountains of France, the area called La Chambon, a town of 5,000 Protestants, Huguenots, saved 5,000 Jews, 5,000 people in the course of the war. They, the Huguenots, had suffered as Protestants around in countries of Catholics, and they had fled into the mountains to be safe. Pastor André Traume was the pastor in La Chambon. He was a pacifist. He wasn't originally from there. And as he learned of the Jews being gathered in Paris into the large gathering places in 1942, from the pulpit, he said, "This is not right. These are human beings. These Jews, too, are human beings." And it led to quiet resistance. He had a cousin, Daniel Dubois, who created a high school at Chapman 2 weeks ago, a 90-year-old who survived the war, who remarkably, his mother was Catholic, but his father was Jewish, and therefore he was vulnerable. He found his way to La Chambon, and he was saved by a school of Daniel Dubois. Daniel Dubois, on June 29th, 1943, was arrested by the Germans and taken to Majdanek and tortured. He would not confess to being Jewish. He wasn't Jewish. And there he died. People in La Chambon were simple farmers. There's a wonderful documentary that was just re-released that Linda and I saw recently. And when they asked, why did you do this? Why did you risk your lives to save Jews, to save people? They said, because it was the right thing to do. How do you explain courage? How do you explain a moral compass? How do you explain being willing to sacrifice for what you believe in? And so why did some respond and others did not? Frankly, it's a bit of a mystery. But do know, let us never forget the righteous of the nations and the enduring question of would we have been one of them? And so where was God? Some grew up with an image of God as the caring parent, always there to reward and to punish. Where was God in Auschwitz? When we were in Auschwitz, our tour guide read a short selection from Night. Elie Wiesel spent some of the war in Auschwitz. And there we were before gallows, where there would be public hangings in Auschwitz. And our guide read that excerpt many of you may know, in which on this particular occasion there were 3 people being hung, 2 adults and a boy of about the age of 12 who was much beloved. And the 2 heavier, older men died quickly, but the boy, as he dangled, was still somehow alive. And somebody said behind Eli, he said, "Where is God?" And Wiesel writes, "In my mind I said, he's there. He's hanging." I have a friend who years ago said to me that he thinks of the Holocaust every day. He's not a child of survivors. He was born in America. He's one of the most impactful Jews I know in the larger American scene. So I called him and I said to him, "I remember you telling me 10 years ago that you think of the Holocaust every day. Did I remember you correctly? And if so, why?" And he said, "Yeah, you do remember it correctly." He said, "You know, I live in a cold area, and whenever I go out and I'm feeling chilled, I think, who am I to complain? I'm not like my ancestors in Eastern Europe were." He said, "I'm always reminding myself not to be spoiled." I held off, he said, going to Auschwitz till 5 years ago, which meant in his mid-70s. And he said, as I was leaving, I stood and I screamed silently, "God, where are you? How could you have abandoned them?" And to my sadness, he said, throughout his life, God had always been a companion. And in 5 years, God hasn't been there. That being in Auschwitz snapped that sense of trust. Where was God? Elie Wiesel would teach that God is a question mark, but what he would also say is that it required reconfiguring what to expect from God. God does not intervene. God gives humans the choice for good or bad, and that's a scary thought. But it doesn't mean that there wasn't a sense of hope, a sense of feeling nurtured by the sense of a caring presence, both in Auschwitz, but even more in reclaiming and finding the capacity to go on with life. My parents did, which leads me to the 4th piece, the 4th question of the fear kashas of Auschwitz. What would I have done? I don't know. I don't know if I would have had my mother and father's strength to say tomorrow will be better. Many didn't. I don't know if I would have had their strength to reclaim life as worth living and bringing new life into the world. I don't know if I would have had the courage to risk my family to save somebody who is not of my family. Would I have been one of those righteous? That question haunts me. It haunts me because we Jews say, where was the world? And we acknowledge that there were some who took those risks for right and wrong. But do we? When do we? 5 questions. You see, the cup of Elijah points to the future. That's who Elijah is. He's the prophet who's going to announce the coming of the Messiah. And so what, in looking forward, are the lessons in terms of our lives? A few that were touched on in terms of answering the 4 questions. One is the need for a moral compass. I said to our teenagers recently over dinner, I'm going to be providing booklets on character making. Why do you think it's important to study character making? And we talked about it, and one girl said, there's a lot of temptations, and it's important to develop a moral compass, to talk and think and learn. There's another piece in terms of how it happened, and that's another teaching of Torah. Al tikach shochad, don't take a bribe. Shochad misalef et einei chachamim. A bribe blinds the eyes of the wise. This is a piece of the Holocaust that's often not discussed until recent times. And that is, as my cousin's husband, Michael Hennenberg, said, it was the biggest heist in world history. One second. There's a priest Dr. Daniel Dubois, who spoke at Chapman. I heard him a few years ago, and he wrote a book it's called The Holocaust by Bullet. 1.5 million Jews were killed by bullets. They were killed by bullets, and here's how it would take place, starting in 1941 through 44. These roving SS would come to a town, and they would take a group of Jews and take them outside of town and have them dig a large hole. The next day, the Jews in these villages, and he's documented over 1,500 of these mass graves. People in the town, the Jews would be called to the big square, and it had a carnival-like atmosphere. Something was going to happen big. And sometimes as they led the Jews out of town, off to the holes where they would be shot, the town would follow behind, go up on a tree and watch. And then there would be an auction. Nazis weren't going to cart off the houses. They weren't going to cart off all those possessions. They were for sale at a discount. And what Father Dubois says is that it became a taboo to talk about it, but it was common. It was the largest transfer of wealth. My cousin's husband, Michael Hennenberg, his father was the only survivor in his family. He was 20 years old, Poland, Auschwitz. When he returned, he went to a neighbor, and the neighbor said, "You got to leave fast. You see, Jews will get killed. The war was over, but they're going to be afraid that you're going to try and take back your family house and all your possessions, and they'll kill you." He ran back to the woods where he would find the American soldiers a week or two later. Which is to say, what are the lessons? The lessons are, in the Holocaust, there was an element of greed, an element of, I gain, I'll look away. Ratcheting down of right and wrong. Feeling like, who am I to talk politics, let alone to get involved? There is danger in doing so. A sense that I'm benefiting now. You take the good with the bad. It's not just about then. I said to Hetty Nihom, one of our congregant survivors, I saw her at Chapman 2 weeks ago. Most of our survivors, not unlike Jack Pariser, who's with us, are already in their 90s. I said, "Hetty, I'm giving a sermon on the Holocaust. What's the lesson?" She's a survivor from Holland. She had lived well. Holland, Western Europe. She said, "Know and tell the congregation it can happen anywhere, at any time, unless you're vigilant." And so, my friends, al chet shechatati, I have sinned. I have sinned by not speaking out about right and wrong, because I don't want to upset people. I have sinned by reading the news and just seeing it as great soap opera rather than lives of people. We may disagree on how many immigrants to allow into this country, but we should not disagree that this is a country in which almost all of us have immigrant parents, grandparents, or immigrants themselves. And what we must know in our bones is that a child is a human being. And how our government treats children at the border, damn it, matters. We may disagree on pollution and the extent to which pollution is a problem, but we can't disagree on as a morality issue that this planet is our responsibility, and if we make it filthy through throwing carbon dioxides and methanes in the air, it will make a difference for our children and grandchildren. We may differ on how to address the problem, but that it's a moral problem is real. We may differ on the nature of impeachment, which will take place this coming year, at least as an issue. But what we cannot differ on is that the law is the law is the law, regardless of your status. When my parents became U.S. citizens, it was different than becoming a French citizen. To become a French citizen, you are born in France. To become an American citizen, you have to learn the basics of American law. That is what unites us, that we are one people, indivisible, under a shared law. We may differ as to how we interpret the law. But if the law is disregarded, know there is a ratcheting down. And that's my last al chet. I am deeply pained that we can't sit together and disagree on some of the policies. There are differences, and I can respect differences. But fundamental rights and wrongs, because it's in our interest, beware of self-interest. On Yom Kippur, we are called to know that our lives are finite and that to live a life of integrity matters. To live a life as a citizen who cares matters. May we listen to each other with respect. That's what I spoke about on Rosh Hashanah. This is not in any way changing the importance of humility in discussing hard questions. But the Holocaust and Passover, our Jewish tradition teaches us that God is the parent of all people, and that unless we see each other as human beings equal in our foundational goodness, in our foundational dignity, then we will ratchet down and not be worthy of Elijah. I am a Jew not because of the Holocaust. I am a Jew despite the Holocaust. But not unlike Passover, we are a religious people, not a tribe. We are a religious people that says, from our suffering, whether 2,500 years ago or 75 years ago, from our suffering we are to derive values that are universal, that we are to hold true to. Ribono shel olam, al chet. Al chet that my words sometimes don't reach all my ears. I'll hate for my own weaknesses in living up to my words. Master of the universe, we as a community stand before you in turbulent times. I am worried for the United States of America. I am. What I'm worried about is this division between us. What I'm worried about is a breaking down of certain foundational elements of what makes us a nation of laws. I am worried about the willingness to see others as in fact other with a capital O. Ribono Shel Olam, in celebration of your presence, may we celebrate the gift of being Jewish. Od Avinu Chai, the message of our ancestors is alive. Am Yisrael Chai, we overcame the losses of the Holocaust, and we thrive. May we feel blessed, and may we act in our lives as among the righteous. Amen.